All right. Hello to our attendees who are joining in. We're going to get started in just a minute with some introductory comments, but we'll give a minute here at the top of the hour for you to all start joining in. All right, we're getting some more attendees filtering in, so I'm going to go ahead and start kicking things off here. So hello and welcome to our panel on Sex Identity Aesthetics, the work of Tobin Siebers and Disability Studies, hosted by the University of Michigan Press and co-sponsored by the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Michigan. We're going to get to this wonderful event in just a couple of minutes, but first I have some logistics to go over and some contextual information about what we have planned for you today. To start, I'm going to drop the link for our slides in the chat for you to access if you would like, especially as there's some links available that you might like to have as we continue here. All right. First, a little orientation to our Zoom webinar features for today. Audio and video will be muted for all attendees. The moderator and panelists will be shown on screen. Q&A and chat are both enabled throughout the event today. If you are having any technical issues, please let us know in the chat, or you can email um.press.mktg@umich.edu. We encourage you to use the chat function for discussion with the panelists and or all participants in today's event. To open the chat window, click the chat button at the bottom of the Zoom application. By clicking the three dots button in the chat pop-out window, you can select who you want to chat with, all panelists or all panelists and attendees. We encourage you to use the Q&A function for questions you want to ask the panelists. To open the Q&A window, you click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom application. To send an anonymous question, you type your question in the box and check the send anonymously checkbox at the bottom there. Today's event is prompted by the release just a few weeks ago of the volume Sex, Identity, Aesthetics, the work of Tobin Siebers and Disability Studies, edited by Gina B. Kim, Joshua Kupetz, Crystal Yin Lie, and Cynthia Wu, and published by the University of Michigan Press. This book, available both in paper and as an open access title, provides a critical review of Tobin Siebers' research in disability studies that goes beyond a merely commemorative collection. Both this book and the legacy of Tobin Siebers are important to the sponsors of our event today. Tobin Siebers was professor of English language and literature and art and design, as well as the co-chair of U of M's Initiative on Disability Studies and V.L. Parrington Collegiate Professor at the time of his death in 2015. The University of Michigan Press published many of his works, including prominent disability studies titles such as Disability Theory in 2008 and Disability Aesthetics in 2010. In 2015, both the press and English department established the Tobin Siebers Memorial Fund to support the annual Tobin Siebers Prize for Disability Studies in the Humanities, which supports the continued publication of timely contributions to disability theory at the University of Michigan Press. There have been 6 award winners to date, the latest being Susan Antebi with her book Embodied Archive, Disability in Post-Revolutionary Mexican Cultural Production, which was published as an open access and paperback title earlier this year. We've assembled a crew of experts today to discuss the impact of Tobin Siebers on disability studies, starting with our moderator, Petra Kuppers. Petra was co-chair of the Initiative on Disability Studies with Siebers and is a disability culture activist in addition to the Anita Gonzalez Collegiate Professor of Performance Studies and Disability Culture at the University of Michigan. Our panelists consist of the 4 editors of Sex Identity Aesthetics, including Gina B. Kim, the Assistant Professor of English and the Study of Women and Gender at Smith College, Joshua Kupetz, who is the Assistant Director of the English Department Writing Program at the University of Michigan, Crystal Yin Lie, who is the Assistant Professor of Comparative World Literature at California State University, Long Beach, and Cynthia Wu, who is the Professor of Gender Studies and Asian American Studies at Indiana University. Our panelists are also joined by the winner of this year's Tobin Siebers Prize, Susan Antebi, who is the Associate Professor of Latin American Literature at the University of Toronto. And with that, I am happy to now turn the figurative microphone over to Petra.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Teresa. Thank you for organizing this panel. Thank you for calling us all together, and welcome everybody who's here. I'm delighted to see so many familiar names, and I hope we can be in dialogue. Today, we have a very exciting panel. I'm so delighted to see the panelists here, who of course have all been here at one point or the other, and it's just so good to see you all. It's just so good for disability studies people to come together and to celebrate Tobin Siebers' amazing work. So I am a white disabled woman with a bald head, yellow glasses, green lipstick appropriate for the season, and a nice pinkish background behind me. And I greet you right now from Anishinaabe territory. And I am really glad to now hand it over to our panelists to tell you something about some of the core concepts that Tobin Siebers has developed and that have continued reverberation throughout the deep field of disability studies. So we thought we'd give you all a 2-minute introduction to 4 core issues in Tobin's work. And the first person who's going to speak to us is Josh, and I'm handing it over to you, Josh. There you go.
Hi, this is Josh speaking. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. I'm so excited that the book is out there for those of you to read and to share. And it's great to see so many of my friends that I haven't had an opportunity to see in quite a while. I'd like to talk for a few minutes about a concept or some concepts from Tobin's book, Disability Theory, called Disability Masquerade and Disability Drag. These concepts are important to the work that I'll be talking about in the next segment of this event as well. So Tobin situated his disability theory work at critical junctures between disciplines, and his concept of disability masquerade grows at the juncture of disability theory, critical race theory, and queer theory. As his mentee, I know that his intention when bringing together different discourses is to productively transform each participant in that conversation. As he considered the practices of passing in racial, gendered, and sexual contexts, he recognized intensive affinities between these phenomena and the practice among some disabled people of manipulating the social legibility of disability to produce or achieve material gains in quotidian life activities. Tobin offers as an example of this type of performance of masquerade his own negotiations of airline travel after enough fraught encounters with gate agents who objected to his attempts to pre-board an aircraft to avoid, in his own words, navigating crowded aisles on wobbly legs. At the time of this writing, Tobin did not consistently use a cane, nor did he use a wheelchair, and he theorizes that the absence of such indexical signs of disability provoked skeptical and often hostile treatment by those for whom his disability was illegible, and thus saw him as not disabled enough, or at worst, a faker. To short circuit this cycle of expository shame, Tobin explains that, quote, he adopted the habit of exaggerating his limp whenever he would rise to pre-board a flight. This dramatization of his impairment, changed to what Cynthia Wu calls a kinesthetic grammar, becomes for Tobin a central truism of the performance of disability masquerade. Turning again to Wu for a clear gloss of the concept, we can think of disability masquerade in the main as the exaggeration of a disability by a disabled person in order to align with non-disabled ideas of what disability looks like. Tobin draws a significant distinction between forms of passing and disability masquerade, however. While forms of passing are based, he argues, in part on one's ability to mimic the legible conventions of other identity categories that are typically more highly valued by dominant, that is, sexist, ableist, white supremacist, heteronormative culture than one's own. thus mitigating or avoiding social stigmatization that dominant groups inflict on subordinate ones. Disabled people who choose to engage in masquerade opt to intensify or heighten their affiliation with a socioeconomically marginalized identity in order to justify access to accommodations or other experiences that they might otherwise be denied. So put another way, masquerade is a hyperbolic performance of self-objection to manage the consequences dealt to non-normative body minds. He acknowledges this self-stigmatization through the origin of the term itself, masquerade, in Joan Riviere's 1929 essay, Womanliness as a Masquerade, which recounts a successful professional woman's performance of presumptively docile, vulnerable femininity as a tactic to offset the negative affect that her other performances of capacity produce in fragile men. To masquerade, just as to pass, one must recognize the legible conventions of dominant identities and know how to flatter or replicate them. So that is a crucial concept. I want to skip ahead to stay on time and talk really quickly then about disability drag. For Tobin, disability drag was the phenomenon of non-disabled people portraying or performing disability, often to great acclaim, as in the case of non-disabled actors whose portrayal of disabled characters is seen as a benchmark of their capacity as actors, and that mark them as serious actors, for example, deserving of praise and institutional accolades. So these concepts, which I'll return to when we talk about our individual projects in a few moments, are central to some ongoing work in my monograph that I'll elaborate in a moment. Thank you.
That was really fabulous. Thank you so much. I think this is so useful for us to hear these contemporary versions of Tobin's amazing work. So that was just really insightful and interesting. And I'm going to hand it over to Crystal for the second one of these concepts.
Thanks, Petra. So just to give a visual description of myself, I am an Asian woman in my 30s, long, dark black hair. I'm wearing a pink shirt, and I have this lovely glass garden door behind me that looks out into somewhere in San Francisco. Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for being here, and I just feel really honored to have gotten to be a part of this project. I helped with the aesthetics section of the anthology, which features essays that largely build on ideas from Tobin's 2010 monograph, Disability Aesthetics. So I'm going to just give a quick introduction to the core concepts of disability art and art vandalism that emerge from that book. So for anyone unfamiliar with it, Disability Aesthetics was a path-breaking work that set out to theorize the representations of disability in modern art. And as a critical concept, disability aesthetics really emphasized the way that disability plays a significant role in the evolution of modern art as a defining feature, something that makes art beautiful. And one of the opening questions that Tobin asks in the introduction is, would the Venus de Milo still be considered one of the great examples of both aesthetic and human beauty if she had both her arms? And he asserts that it is, in fact, disability or the estrule of uniformity and perfection that makes the sculpture beautiful. And this claim becomes the foundation for his argument about the centrality of disability in modern and contemporary art as a unique resource for both aesthetic creation as well as appreciation. So according to Tobin, disability moves viewers because of its refusal of harmony, bodily integrity, and perfect health. And modern art really embraces disability as a distinct version of the beautiful. Or put another way, it's argued that broken beauty, or what one might call damaged art, like the Venus de Milo, refuse to be solely interpreted as ugly or, say, defective. Rather, these forms reflect a new kind of beauty, one that demands viewers to rethink disability as an aesthetic value in and of itself. So Tobin's theorization of art vandalism then and the experience of looking at vandalized artwork builds on this point. And he notes that works of art that have been vandalized are often described as victims of assault, or and that observers of vandalized paintings often or paintings and statues often convey a sense of insult and hurt at the injury done to them. So while these works of vandalized art might not have anything to do with disability content-wise, their damaged form invokes the idea of disability in its beholders, which is why vandalism can be considered art about disability. And so the vandalized image then is like a body that has been injured, broken, or made imperfect, and it's in this new form that the artwork actually becomes more raw, immediate, and potent. And as Tobin writes, beholders discover in vandalized works more an image of disability that asks to be contemplated not as a symbol of human imperfection, but as an experience of the corporeal variation found everywhere in modern life. So while not condoning acts of vandalism, Tobin finds art vandalism a rich site for debating what can be considered art and who might be considered artists, noting that rare is the act of vandalism that does not produce some variation on the accusation of mental disability. And this leads him to question prejudices against mentally disabled artists and mental difference in relation to creativity writ large. So overall, disability art and art vandalism, they're essential to modern aesthetics for their ability to elicit these kind of powerful emotions, this feeling of beauty as well, and prompt reflections on our shared humanity. And in the anthology, you'll see that the authors that take up disability aesthetics in their chapters extend some of these claims about modern art, but into forms or examinations of things like music, signed and tactile languages, installation art, and even the teaching of art history. Okay, so that's what I have. So I'll hand it over to Gina.
Thank you so much indeed. Gina, over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Gina Kim. I am an East Asian woman with a mullet. I have frosted tips, wire rim glasses, a camel colored button down. My background is blurred. I am going to talk about Tobin's concept of a sexual culture for disabled people. I was in charge of the sex section, which is short but robust, I would argue. And I will also be talking about the concept of sexual culture for disabled people in my mini presentation, because I have been thinking a lot alongside it. So basically, this concept is one he explored in disability theory, and it was also excerpted as the first chapter for the 2012 anthology. I feel like the blur is not really helping here, but the 2012 anthology, Sex and Disability. And just to give you some context for that anthology, so it was edited by Robert McRuer and Anna Malo. It intervened into existing understandings of disabled sexuality that either evacuate disabled people of erotic desire or fetishize them as sexual objects. McRuer and Malo ask, but what if disability were sexy? And what if disabled people were understood to be both subjects and objects of a multiplicity of erotic desires and practices? So the idea of, or the concept sexual culture for disabled people frames disabled people as sexual minorities alongside a spectrum of sexual minorities, and argues that advancing the sexual liberation of disabled people would similarly benefit all others oppressed by dominant sexual cultures and norms. He advances the term sexual culture as the hinge of the argument and contrasts it with a more frequently circulated term, sex life. One thing I've always appreciated about Tobin scholarship is its incredible specificity and clarity about terminology and language. And so when he's describing sexual culture, he writes, sexual culture references the experience of sex itself. By sexual culture, I mean to suggest two ideas about how disabled sexuality disrupts the notion of sex life. First, sexuality assumes a larger role in the quotidian life of people with disabilities than the usual phrase sex life indicates. Second, the idea of a sex life is ableist. So to elaborate on the first point, Siebers points out that disabled people often are not able to have access to the private spaces that sex sometimes requires, that the stigma of disability may actually impede someone from having sex, and that due to embodied and or unminded difference, disabled people do not necessarily have the kind of sex that registers with or is legible under dominant erotic scripts. I also feel that the term culture denotes the structural, right, rather than the domain of the individual, which I feel like sex life suggests, right? And so Siebers suggests that structural change is necessary for disabled people to have sexual culture. Chief to this is the idea of access, or the issue of access, right? So disabled people at the bare minimum need to be able to access spaces for having sex. In addition to structural change, Siebers also highlights what he terms, quote, alternative sexual cultures based on the artfulness of disability, end quote, which I will be getting more into with my mini presentation. But this is the idea that non-normative body minds and the ways in which disabled people have sex, right, can actually remap the body's erogenous and erotic zones and completely transform or reconfigure what we think is possible with regards to erotic practices and intimacies. So it's about, you know, disability as an ingenious way of life, disability as a practice of erotic invention, which I will get to in greater depth later on in the presentation. I will stop here in the interest of time.
Thank you, that was wonderful. Let's hand it over to Cynthia Wu. Cindy, you go.
Hi, I'm Cindy Wu, and it's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues in the attendee list. I'm a middle-aged East Asian person with short black hair, and I'm sitting in a room with white walls. I have a poorly behaved cat who likes to get in front of my screen, and I'm trying to get her to give me some space. Thank you. I'm also sitting on Shawnee, Miami, and Potawatomi territory, which is called Bloomington, Indiana by most settlers. So I want to thank Teresa and Petra for organizing this panel. And a big thank you goes to Sarah Jo Cohen at the University of Michigan Press for her editorial expertise with this project. This was actually my second time working with Sarah because she also did my second book while she was at Temple. So it was a wonderful experience being paired up with her again. And I'm always impressed by her editorial work. So I'm the person who is supposed to describe complex embodiment. Okay, that's better. Complex embodiment can be thought of as a way to complicate the social model of disability, which was already progressive to begin with, because it shifted attention from, quote unquote, fixing the body or the mind to fixing society. So that's a good thing. And Tobin and everyone else in the field of disability studies thought so as well, because it's supposed to be a more progressive alternative to the medical model of disability. However, Tobin thought that the social model of disability was too deterministic because it didn't take into account that bodies can and do change their environments. So environments aren't static, and people who have disabled bodies and minds can impact the environment and shift it. So in other words, there's a reciprocal dynamic between bodies and their environments. The other thing was that Tobin also wanted to allow space for thinking about the body's materiality that the social model of disability seems hostile to. And complex embodiment is a call for thinking about materiality in nuanced ways, especially when it comes to issues like chronic pain. Because most people who experience chronic pain will tell you that given a choice between having their pain go away or a society that is designed so that it's more amenable to being in pain, they just want their pain to go away. So again, complex embodiment can take into account the materiality of bodies that the social model of disability seems to be hostile to. So that's what I have. And I think we're shifting onto the second segment of this panel.
That's right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for this really lucid and exciting presentations. I mean, I think this is so helpful for many of us who are here on the call to remind ourselves of the concepts and how they find themselves rooted in your edition as well. So that was really, really powerful. Thanks, everybody. And yeah, I'm just introducing the second part now. So the second segment of our presentation will be everybody speaking between 5 and 7 minutes about either their current work or about the reflections on the conference that was the origin point of the edition that we're celebrating today, or of course, the editing of the book itself. And then we're ending with a celebration of Susan's book and her award. And I'm just beginning by celebrating a project that Tobin helped bring to fruition, different from the projects that we've already discussed. I am someone who works in the field. I'm someone who works in collaboration with other people, in practice, and that while that wasn't necessarily Tobin's thing, he was so important to bringing to fruition this first project that I started at the University of Michigan, the Anaka project. And I have a slide here in front of you, which shows a Black woman. This is Anita Gonzalez, one of the collaborators. And this is a photo by Lisa Steichman, created with an alternative photography process, where you see the image doubled, ghosted, haunted, all these rich metaphors that we're activating in this project, which evokes haunting memories of 3 Alabama slave women who in the 1840s persevered through years of medical experimentation at the hands of J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of American gynecology. So that's the project that I put up here, and I thought it was really good for me to remember this moment when Tobin welcomed me to the University of Michigan and then helped fund this project that went on for years and still has a lot of reverberations, a lot of connections out there in the world. So it was wonderful for me it was good for me to remember that and to use this as an introduction to our panelists now. So we can take this slide away, and I'm going to hand it over to the first of the panelists, and the first one is Gina. So here we go. Thank you. I think all the slides can go now for a while. Thank you.
Okay, hello. I don't have any slides, so it'll just be me. And I actually want to talk a little bit about how I'm thinking quite literally at this present moment, with Tobin's writing around sexual culture for disabled people and disabled sexuality. So right now, I'm in the middle of writing a book that is tentatively titled Dreaming of Infrastructure, Crip of Color Imaginaries After the US Welfare State. And I just want to note that the first part of the title, Dreaming of Infrastructure, is an homage to another important Michigan mentor of mine, Patsy Yeager, who also passed away during my graduate work. This book is the outgrowth and development of the dissertation project I wrote while a grad student at Michigan, which is titled Anatomy of the City, Race, Disability, and US Fictions of Dependency. So first, I just want to give kind of a contextual overview of the book, and then talk a little bit about how Tobin's work is really helping me think through this one chapter in it. So Dreaming of Infrastructure examines political and aesthetic engagements with public dependency discourse in the literary cultural afterlife of 1996 US welfare reform. Over 20 years after Bill Clinton pledged to, quote, end welfare as we know it, the mythical threat of state dependence continues to animate the national imagination. Organized around figures such as the welfare queen, the undocumented immigrant, and the disabled non-worker, this myth conjures up the specter of needy populations, implicitly racialized and feminized, draining the American public of its hard-earned resources. The malignment of dependency represents a key tactic in the ongoing evisceration of vital public infrastructures and social services, the consequences of which we see fully in our present moment. Not only has this narrative crucially shaped contemporary US public policy, but also, as my book asserts, the writing of women and queers of color who dreamed, theorized, and fought under the long shadow of Reagan. Looking to feminist disability theories of interdependency, Dreaming of Infrastructure demonstrates how contemporary ethnic American writers, such as Audre Lorde, Octavia Butler, Jesmyn Ward, Samuel Delaney, Leah Lakshmi Paipchna Samarasinha, and Karante Yamashita, recuperate the maligned condition of dependency. They do so, I argue, through their imaginative engagements with public infrastructure, transportation, sanitation, healthcare, and education. In so doing, they highlight dependency on human and material infrastructures alike, the often ignored pipes, wires, roads, and labor networks that regulate contemporary life. Within this body of text, infrastructure invites reflection on the vast networks of assistance that enable one to move throughout the world. In the words of feminist disability scholar Rosemarie Garland Thompson, quote, our bodies need care. We all need assistance to live, end quote. Public infrastructure thus becomes a primary site for articulating a discourse of interdependency, one that documents the disabling violence of state divestment while foregrounding a public ethics of care. So at this moment, I am at work on my chapter on sanitation and sanitation work, which examines Black queer writer and speculative fiction legend Samuel Delaney's 2012 novel titled Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders. It's a sprawling 800-page epic full of kinky sex that centers queerness and disability. At the center of the novel is the lifelong queer partnership, an interracial, incestuous family structure shared by Eric Jeffers, who's the protagonist, his mixed race partner, Morgan Haskell, who goes by the nickname of Shit, and Shit's white father, Dynamite Haskell. Sanitation workers by trade, the three characters make their living by carting garbage away from the dump a Black, gay, and as I argue, disabled community characterized as much by its disdain of Reagan-era social policies as by its commitments to piss play, perverse pleasures, and public sex. So in this chapter, I demonstrate how the novel poses waste and waste management as a potential node of affinity linking Black, queer, and disability politics, as all of these populations have been framed by welfare reform rhetoric as wasteful, abject, unproductive, and have by extension been treated as disposable. Yet rather than disavowing waste and its associations with unproductivity, abjection, and excessiveness, Through the Valley leans into the representational possibilities of waste, leveraging the joys of hedonistic queer and disabled sex in order to flout the disciplinary reproductive ethos of Reagan and Clinton era welfare reform. Through its depictions of robust civic and erotic infrastructures that serve the vulnerable populations who inhabit the dump, the novel develops its own ethics and politics of waste that centers the pleasure, long-term sustenance, and conviviality of those deemed disposable by social policies. Our introduction to the novel's reclamatory ethic of waste management begins with Eric, the protagonist, his initial entrance into a local institution known as Turpin's Truck Stop, where a lot of public sex happens. So Turpin's functions both as an erotic point of entry into the Black, gay, disabled, separatist community known as the dump, right? As well as an anchor site throughout the novel. Here he meets boatman Jay McGammon, who describes the public sex scene at the truck stop bathroom as an explicitly interclass, cross-racial, and most importantly for my argument, cross-abled zone of erotic contact. So in introducing the scene, Jay mentions his partner as a key part of the action, and notes that he only communicates in ASL. There are scenes throughout the novel where we see the other characters communicating with this character in ASL, right? So I also want to note that he's not the only disabled character present in this utopian community, which very much makes central non-normative bodies, sexualities, and sensibilities. So key to my understanding of disabled sexuality in Delaney's novel is, of course, Tobin's work on a sexual culture for disabled people, which, just to revisit, argues for the necessity of sexual accessibility and further demonstrates how disabled experiences of sexuality can often and necessarily overhaul dominant scripts for erotic and intimate expression. The centrality of disability in the dump social world similarly engages the question of access, placing Siebers and Delaney in dialogue. The cross-abled bathroom orgy at Turpin's Truck Stop extends Delaney's theorization of what he terms contact relations and public sex and cruising zones. Delaney writes, given the mode of capitalism under which we live, life is at its most rewarding, productive, and pleasant when the greatest number of people understand, appreciate, and seek out interclass contact and communication conducted in a mode of goodwill. So he's really into people from different social and economic backgrounds making contact, right? And poses public sex and cruising as a primary place where this happens. The practice of cross-abled contact between disabled and abled queer bodies in Delaney's novel similarly crosses power boundaries, particularly as these boundaries pertain to questions of access. That is, access to the physical places of public sex, but also to economies of desirability writ large. Though disabled people are regularly exiled from social and erotic spheres, the disabled residents of the dump are key to the community's erotic life, as well as to its larger social fabric. That is, by framing disabled people as both desiring subjects and objects of desire, Through the Valley situates its disabled subjects within the realm of the social, and as such, understands them as central to determining the dump's communal ethics and modes of relationality. From Mex to a character known as Big Man Markham, disabled characters populate the novel's pages. They play a vital role in the community's shared commitment to pushing the limits of bodily intimacy, as well as exploring the multiplicity of ways different bodies might enjoy sexual and social contact. The character Big Man Markham, for instance, makes necessary use of a catheter bag that then becomes a key element in his many sexual encounters. In this way, his catheter hose becomes a kind of erogenous zone in and of itself, an erotic extension of the body. It functions as a kind of sex toy that allows him to more easily participate in the many piss orgies that unfold throughout the novel, thus both reconfiguring and refusing given scripts for bodily intimacy. However, Big Man is not only reduced to the use of his catheter hose, he is also a key member of community life, and his annual holiday parties become a regular staple for dump residents, all of whom really revel in abjection and deviance. Through the Valley thus also demonstrates how Delaney's loving depictions of disabled folks enjoying kinky sex, in fact, refuses a politics of respectability that is more oriented towards inclusion into a normative social sphere. In this way, Delaney's novel also pushes beyond the concept of access, right? Which in so many ways can align with a reformist platform of inclusion, and instead orients us towards the many ways that disability can enable the radical reinvention and transformation of sexual culture writ large. Okay. I'm sorry, that was a little on the long side.
It was on the fascinating side, though. It was fascinating. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I'm going to hand it over to Crystal now.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really fascinating, Gina. Thank you. So I would like to just start with a few reflections on organizing the Crypt Futurities Conference before talking about my research. So I helped co-organize the conference when I was in my third year at Michigan. And it was really truly one of the highlights of my time there. In fact, I often think back on it as one of the most energizing and inspiring moments of my graduate career, just because, I mean, we got to meet and learn from just so many different disability studies colleagues in all stages of their careers. And it was just this great experience to work with, people from my cohort and the cohorts above and below mine. And I also just learned so much about accessible event planning on like a fairly large scale, having to organize for about over like 60 conference attendees from all over the country and some, I think, abroad too. And so in fact, we actually held a follow-up event after the conference that was just on accessible event planning for graduate students, faculty members, and community organizers that were interested in making their events more accessible. So that was also really cool. So, a lot of our work over the months in planning this conference was just making sure we were creating a space that was maximally accessible. So like ensuring there were access maps, interpreters, cart, transportation services, accessible accommodations, inclusive catering options, communication badges like transcripts, etc. And the way that we all came together to work on making the conference accessible was just something that I wish I saw more often at other events. And I want to say that, we together kind of created our own little like accessibility utopia during this conference that I found was really special. And that's just something that has really stuck with me. And it's something that, I really strive to do now when I organize events as a faculty member. And it's something that I try to get my students really passionate about too, right? Like thinking about accessibility and advocating for themselves and others. So that's one thing about the conference that I think about often. So in terms of my own research, I finished my dissertation in 2019 at the end. So I'm still pretty fresh on what I'm doing with my dissertation, either turning it into a monograph or also kind of publishing articles here and there from it. But in general, so I work on dementia in contemporary literature and life writing, especially writing that deals with the personal and historical memory of trauma and violence in different global locations. So I really, my work just brings a disability studies lens to bear on dementia, centering dementia as a valuable and valid way of being in the world. My work asks what it means to dwell less on the loss of individual memory as deficit and more on the relational and the supportive modes of remembering and care that can be gained. And in general, stories of dementia that I've come across in my work, they're not typically read as entailing any wider political meaning beyond like the emotionally charged metaphors that have kind of accrued around them, symbolizing things like crises, loss, and social death or political amnesia, which is just another disability metaphor. So I'm interested in authors that instead deploy dementia as a kind of aesthetic and ethical resource. And so here you can see a bit of Tobin's influence trickling into the work. And so my work really tries to interrogate, established myths and metaphors about dementia, but also strives to highlight counter narratives, right, that unearth some of the complexity with which dementia is used in these contemporary texts as valuable heuristics for authors' explorations of relationships across history, time, and place. And I'm also interested in showing how literature can hold space for embodied aging difference, and this can have implications for practical care and social justice work. So some of the writing that I'm doing involves discussing works that recuperate negative discourses surrounding aging and cognitive impairment and how they can help us think differently about how we engage with history and each other in positive, if not more enriching ways. And I look at the way these dementia narratives or sort of revisionary narratives of dementia highlight possibilities for new modes of relationality, sociality, and forms of communication. And I explore some of these ideas and the notion of a dementia aesthetic in a forthcoming article that I have coming out in a few months in the journal Biography. And that's on a graphic memoir titled Alzheimer's Through the Looking Glass by Dina Walrath. And that being a graphic memoir, that also brings me to my other area of research, which is more generally on disability and graphic narratives and the way that comics take up disability as an aesthetic resource. And so I recently also finished an article on crypt time as space in a graphic memoir on chronic illness that should be coming out in the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies at some point. And I've also been working on, most recently, an article on teaching disability, comics, and race in the era of Black Lives Matter. This project kind of derailed my writing from my dissertation because it just became something so important to me, because one of the classes I teach is an introductory comics class as well as literature and medicine. So this started taking up my attention. And so in this article, I'm really trying to push there's this new field and genre. It's called graphic medicine, and it focuses on comics and healthcare discourse. But what I'm trying to do is integrate disability studies into the field and push graphic medicine into more intersectional directions to grapple with issues and representations of race alongside medicine, which it doesn't really do to a very full extent right now. So I'm really trying to bridge disability studies, Black comic studies, and critical race theory to talk about comics that deal with the debilitating effects of state violence and gun violence and racism as they're represented in comics. And I'm looking at comics like Victor LaValle's Destroyer or the series called Bitter Root. And these comics aren't usually discussed as comics about disability or healthcare or medicine per se, but nevertheless, they invoke it in their form and their characterization. So there again, you can see some of the influences that disability aesthetics has had on this research on comics. So yeah, and more generally, I'm also just really interested in the ways that comic artists disable normative conventions in comics, as some of the foundational work in comics theory has or often relies on images of able-bodiedness to kind of describe its own theories. And comics and comic authors sort of also, comics are created assuming a reader that is seeing and or hearing, right? So one kind of exciting collaboration that I'm trying to move forward is I'm working on something with a professor at Gallaudet University, the Deaf University in Washington, DC, and we're organizing potentially a symposium of some kind on comic studies, disability studies, and deaf studies to think about what comics centering a deaf aesthetic might look like. So that's the current gamut of my research. It's kind of everywhere. But yeah, okay, that's all I have. So I'll turn it over to Josh now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And congrats on all these amazing articles. And I can tell you that there are people in the attendee list who were really fascinated by what you just said. So you might get some emails about that. Over to Josh.
Hi, this is Josh Kupetz speaking again. And I realize I forgot to do an image description the first time. I think that's because over the course of the pandemic, I've almost completely lost all sense of self. And so I will, I'm a white male in his 40s with dark hair who looks tired. I have an image of the sculpture called The Cube on U of M's campus behind me as my artificial backdrop. I would like to actually go back and talk a little bit more about Tobin's Disability Masquerade as a bridge into some concerns that I am currently working on in my scholarship. I'm going to try to do that quickly because my 10-year-old daughter Edith and 8-year-old son Oscar are due home from school at any moment, which will be very loud, given that my daughter is for the first time bringing home a trombone. So yeah, so keep me lifted up in your thoughts for now and the rest of the academic year. Okay, I'm joking so to keep from thinking about it too deeply. All right. So to go back very briefly to Disability Masquerade and in some of Tobin's critical practice as a way of bridging into something that I'm doing in the present. According to Thomas Abrams in his essay in the volume that we are celebrating today, Tobin willfully turns the theoretical earth in fields judged to be a bit out of fashion or out of step with contemporary trends and critique. While Abrams makes this comment in reference to Tobin's engagement with identity politics and identity in general, we can also perhaps see a similar iconoclasm in his tendency to create categories, to classifications, and to enumerate them in his work. At the risk of being painted as a totalizer, Tobin often offers lists and rubrics, ones that he acknowledges are partial or incomplete, and he does so with his definition of masquerade, offering 6 tactics or fables that demarcate his sense of that coinage. Before engaging those specific tactics, though, I want to take a moment to acknowledge how generative this theoretical strategy can be. far from closing down our understanding of how disabled people render disability legible for non-disabled audiences, Tobin's 6 categories provide a form through which the as yet unwritten scope of the practice can become visible. Or said another way, by staking some territorial lines around the concept, Tobin invites the audience to also see what's been left outside of those boundaries, perhaps wrongfully or accidentally so, as well as what he's placed inside them. You know, as Jack Kerouac said, if we want to talk about unfashionable, and perhaps paraphrasing the Buddha, it's only through form that we can realize emptiness. That emptiness opens out like the lawns Tobin describes in Among Men. Their emptiness exists to invite us to fill them. And just as an aside, every time I cut my lawn and I near almost completing the lawn in the middle of the lawn, I think about the essay he writes about that and how no one would ever willfully finish cutting their lawn in the center. That's something for me to work out on my own, I guess. So I want to quickly talk a little bit about the first 4 tactics or fables that work in disability masquerade, and then quickly touch on the last 2, and then talk about for the last 2 or 3 minutes about my own work. So the first tactic for disability masquerade is that masquerade can inflect public and private spaces to create a public view of disability for political ends. And Tobin illustrates this tactic by referencing the 1990 Capitol Steps protest, in which 36 ADAPT protesters who set aside their wheelchairs to climb up the stairs in a spectacle that did not match how they would typically access the Capitol, in order to emphasize disability, the lack of access, and to generate political attention. A second fable or tactic is as a signal of in-group affiliation or a nod to non-disabled people that a crip moves or not among them. And I think here, Stephanie Kirschbaum's work on disability disclosure is a really interesting furthering of this idea. A third tactic is to contravene an existing mode of oppression, is in the case of Irving Zola's use of a wheelchair to diffuse non-disabled disgust at slower ambulation. So in the example Tobin provides, Zola says, people were sick of me kind of puttering in front of them. And so when I use the wheelchair, people recognize that it becomes legible as a sign of disability, and therefore attitudes don't necessarily get a lot better, but they change, right? And then fourth, masquerade can put expectations and prejudices about disability into the service of disabled people in ways that upset, again, other expectations. For example, someone who uses a cane to board a bus, but then pulls out a novel to read once the bus is in motion, is manipulating in some way expectations about what disability and capacity actually mean. The final 2 tactics are typically used by non-disabled people to produce positive effects among non-disabled people. And these include narrative structures that benefit an able-bodied public by reinforcing what Tobin calls the ideology of ability, or the unstated widespread preference for ability over disability. And we might think about overcoming narratives or inspiration porn as examples of this. And then finally, disability drag, which I spoke of earlier, when non-disabled people portray or perform disability to acclaim. At the time, at the time that I worked with Tobin, I saw my work growing out of his concept of complex embodiment. But as more time has passed since then, I realized that an important part of the theoretical and critical work that I pursue in literary disability studies has to do with the expressive capacities in masquerade, both the liberating moments brought about by the willful overturning of convention, as well as the constricting, decapacitating moments occasioned by the use of disability as a ready-made metaphor to signify something other than itself, a term that more often than not devalues disability and dehumanizes the disabled. In my own work, I myself might be accused of turning to the unfashionable, for although I'm primarily interested in how disability operates as an expressive formal resource in literary texts, meaning how disability inflects the forms that poems and stories take, part of me is still stuck in representation. I don't linger on representation to explicate so good or bad representations, but because something about the way readers, even critical readers like disability studies scholars, discuss literary disability provides, I think, a critical insight into disability epistemology and ontology itself. As readers, we recognize disability in texts. We name it in the complete absence of material bodies beyond the physical texts themselves. We locate disability through ink on paper, light emitted from devices, impressions we feel through our fingers, sounds we hear from our readers. Some version of disability itself arrives in our encounters with these texts. For that reason, while scholars like Michael Berube always remind us that in his work he is, quote, relying on the ancient and yet always critical insight that literary characters are not real people, and that, quote, we are talking fictional people with fictional disabilities, I simply disagree. No matter which non-medical model of disability one follows, we likely agree that disability is at least partially semiotic, at least partially discursive. Might not the presence of those same signs then, or the articulation of those same forms of thought and truth claims about non-normative body minds suggest that disability is actually present, even if only in part, in literary texts? And what could that presence mean for disabled people? So in my work, I call this phenomenon, meaning the cognitive and affective recognition of disability in a text, the disability effect. As the disability effect elaborates across two steps, I would suggest that its textual dynamics resonate with several of Tobin's notions of disability masquerade. First, the text disables a character through an act of description, and second, the text embeds that description in a combination of semiotic, syntactic, and semantic networks that convert those descriptions to narrative functions. In the first step, a word or phrase that describes a physical or cognitive impairment disrupts the semiotic chain by evoking an essentialist concept of disability that seems to precede discursive entanglement. Disabling details, these details appear either as descriptions of observable somatic or cognitive characteristics, a first order technique of representation, or in networks of metonymic signs or figures, a second order system of signification that foregrounds a state of unfitness through the combined effects of asymptotic references to particular impairments. Each technique causes the detail in the text to fibrillate between the concrete and the figural, a semantic instability that textualizes the material semiotic nature of disability itself. When the disability effect invokes an overdetermined disability cliche, what I otherwise call disability kitsch, as it does in a realist novel like William Dean Howells' A Hazard of New Fortunes, 1890, it trades in Tobin's last two tactics. When the disability effect extends, reinvigorates, or supplants narrative aesthetics in new and pleasurable ways, as it does in Stephen Crane's novella The Monster, 1898, it traces Tobin's first four. I don't wish to dwell on my paranoid reading of Howells, except to say that Howells' deployment of disability for aesthetic and political ends in A Hazard of New Fortunes might be intended to disrupt conventional topologies, but the figural power of literary disability in the novel rises precisely from its own typological hyperbolic legibility. To wit, Berthold Lindau, a German-born veteran of the human army whose left hand has been amputated due to a war wound, ultimately serves as a curative figure whose strict moral and ethical influence affects homogenizing changes in the central normative characters in the novel. And Lindau does this, of course, by dying. In Crane's The Monster, however, the narrative produces disability not through hyper-realistic descriptions, but by marshaling a set of details that animate conventional ideas about disability as such. In the novel, Henry Johnson, a Black laborer who works for the White Trescott family, suffers significant burns to his face and limbs while rescuing Billy Trescott, the young son, from a house fire. The bulk of the novel concerns Henry's life after the accident, how his aesthetic disability shapes his life chances in a community that sees him as both living and socially dead due to disfigurement. While Crane's fiction is often referenced for its so-called authenticity, particularly the Red Badge of Courage, The Monster leaves Henry's post-injury face largely undescribed. Instead of detailing the particular post-burn contours of his face, Crane offers only figural gestures that border on the impossible. One wonders, for example, in what regard Henry can be said to have, quote, no face, unquote. These vague descriptions seem to operate as anti-details. By frustrating the reader's ability to perceive, descriptions of Henry's no face invite the reader to complete the image, him or herself, perhaps, to substitute a clear image with the concept of facelessness. If the reader sees Henry's disfigurement at all, he or she can only do so by filling in the empty space of no face with details culled from a mental repository of disability imagery. Such reader-supplied details generate affect because they are mediated by the individual's relationship to disability per se, through an act of cognition separate from and preceding the experience of the sensation of reading. This phenomenon helps explain Jonathan Tadashi Naito's curious claim that Crane uses, quote, vivid and disquieting imagery to describe Henry Johnson, when no such images, at least not any vivid ones, are to be found. For me, the anti-detail strains my sense of credulity. Naito, ostensibly the anti-detail pulses in near horror. Read against the grain, however, the monster might appear as an instance of Tobin's first tactic, providing a view of disability for political purposes. In the absence of specific details in the novella, Henry is most obviously disabled through the social interactions that frame him either as a participant or an object. There's a judge and a doctor debate on whether or not Henry is alive, although he's alive, for example, and what should be done about it. By divorcing Henry's disability from a description of his material body and attaching it to social attitudes, the monster presents an argument that disability is a transcendent product of meaning, not just the imminent sensation that erupts when certain bodies encounter other bodies. So that's just one little bit of what I do and its indebtedness to Tobin. So thanks for listening to that. And again, just my last chance probably to say thank you so much for being here and for me being a part of this.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was great. And I'm handing it over to Cindy.
Wow, these are amazing research presentations. And, thank you, Gina, Crystal, and Josh so far for sharing with us what you're working on. I think that the future of disability studies is in great hands. So yeah, that's inspiring. So instead of sharing a bit of what I'm working on in the long term, I thought that I would read a short passage from my chapter in the anthology. So in midlife, Tobin wrote a memoir called Among Men, which I read as a subtle piece of theorizing about the instability of identity in many different ways. Now, the field of disability studies has contributed a lot of theorizing to this notion of identity in ways that go beyond the empirical or the positivist and demonstrates how identity is contingent, but at the same time, it doesn't completely jettison, again, the materiality or the ontology of identities. And I would like to think that it does so in these complex and nuanced ways. So in Among Men, one of these aspects of identity theorizing that Tobin does concerns socioeconomic class. And I'm going to read a short passage from my chapter that demonstrates this. Siebers never uses the term working class in his memoir, Among Men. In several instances, he identifies his family's economic position by appealing to description. Multiple passages mention his father's blue-collar job and a work ethic associated with it. This father, quote, had a third-grade education, end quote, and his own father, Siebers' grandfather, was, quote, a mason and a carpenter, end quote. A vignette musing on the state of marriage begins with mention of the author's parents' wedding. Too, quote, poor, end quote, for much of a honeymoon, his mother and father drove from their small Wisconsin town to visit Milwaukee and returned the next day, where his father returned to, quote, work in the sour air of the mill, fixing the machines that make paper, end quote. However, the declaration of being working class never appears. The memoir's narrative present situates the author, an adult taking a backward glance at his childhood, in a very different social location. Here, the omission of the term working class is a strategic one. As many people who advocate for racial equality have long experienced, the voicing of a working class identity among white men is frequently mobilized to discredit those justice claims. This happens in the academy as well as in other spaces. Additionally, the identity claim of being working class in these contexts overlooks intersectionality because a disproportionate number of people of color are economically disenfranchised. Class has long been tied to race in the United States because of historical circumstances related to race and property ownership. Siebers's refusal to articulate his early life history through recourse to this identity claim is ethical. He refrains from the utterance of working class identity because of how it has often functioned in dismissing critiques of racism. The pride that Siebers takes in his socioeconomic origins is obvious, but the slipperiness and contingency of working class identity becomes salient when we consider that some people move across class strata as he did. Yet Tobin was still known for his mentoring of students from working class backgrounds. At his memorial, I spoke with several of his former graduate students across multiple racial categories who told me versions of the same story. They felt out of place at the elite university. Their own parents never went to college. They wanted to drop out of the program. One had actually scheduled a meeting with Tobin not to seek counsel, but to inform him of her impending departure. After confiding in Tobin about these concerns and learning he had similar life experiences, they came away with a renewed sense of their entitlement to an advanced degree. They all finished their PhD. Generally, I am not a fan of identity-based mentoring in the way it often gets rallied to justify faculty hiring. First, it lets majoritized faculty off the hook in learning how to teach and advise all students. Second, it ties the value of minoritized faculty to an institution's demographics rather than to the faculty members' intellectual contributions, which may have nothing to do with their identity. However, that Tobin was able to reach students who otherwise did not find the university hospitable indicates that in the class privilege realm of the academy, he had knowledge forged from the material conditions of his personal history that these students found credible. Having done this, he inspires me to commit more decisively to something similar, a cultivation of credibility on the basis of shared lived experience in my own mentoring work. Okay, that's it for now.
Thank you so much, Cindy. That was a wonderful passage to read and both moving and powerful in its testimony. Thank you so much. And we are going over now to Susan Antebi, who just received the Tobin Siebers Prize for Disability Studies in the Humanities for her book. We're celebrating her. We're delighted that you received this award, and we'd love to know more about the book. So over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Petra and Teresa, for organizing, and thank you to all of you for incorporating me into this panel on your wonderful Sex Identity and Aesthetics anthology, which I've just really enjoyed reading. I also wanted to echo Cindy's words and especially thank Sarah Cohen and note that it happens to be her birthday today. So happy birthday to Sarah, who I think is here with us. And thank you as well to David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder, of course, because it's been great to work with both of you. Great, so I'll give a brief overview of the book. It's been quite a challenge to think about how to sum things up in 5 to 7 minutes, and then I also wanted to speak briefly about the many ways that I think Tobin Siebers' work has influenced my thinking in sort of some direct and obvious ways, and then some maybe more subtle and kind of underpinning ways in this book and in my sort of teaching and thinking overall. So the book itself, it does have a focus that's specifically on Mexico in the period of the 1920s to the 1940s. So it's the post-revolution in Mexico, but it's very much configured in terms of the relationship between that period and and later and the present day, and Mexico in transnational context. And so thinking about how we encounter that work and those documents from our current and situated perspective. I focus on eugenics and hygiene as discourses that are strongly in operation in this period. And eugenics generally in Latin America is configured as, let's say, softer than the eugenics that maybe many of us have read about in Northern European or US or Canadian contexts. So in the sense that the focus is less on sterilization law or actual genocide and more on actual projects of hygiene, on IQ testing, on bodily measurements, anthropometrics or testing of school children, also anti-alcoholism campaigns, anti-syphilis campaigns, new projects in architectural renovation that will be more healthful for school children and for workers. So all these types of hygiene projects are configured as part of a discourse to enhance the future and present population. And it's very much intertwined with the notion of a current and future race. So racial discourse is really inseparable from notions of pathology and the idea of studying and researching the Mexican child in order to come up with a configuration of what normal looks like in that context. So one of my main arguments in the book is that in this context, disability is configured and emerges as contingent on various factors. And in this way, actually Cindy's chapter on it depends really resonated with me, and that connection to Tobin's work, that identity is contingent and yet it's still intertwined and doesn't get rid of the material body, I think is really important. So in the Mexican context of eugenics and hygiene, this idea of contingency, as I read it, has to do with the idea that disability is not so much associated with a specific body in the present moment, but rather it's configured as the possible cause of something that happened in past generations, such as an alcoholic grandparent that therefore is producing lower education levels in the current generation, or else like the horizon of a negative outcome that may befall a person or a family if they engage in risky behaviors or unhygienic or immoral behaviors. So there's that temporal mode of contingency. There's also a spatial mode of contingency that I think has a lot to do with the relationship between school children and other people and their built environment. And so that's very interesting to me to see how there's that mutual influence between the built environment and the human body, and how these features inform and construct one another. And also the role of statistics, which of course kind of grows up together with eugenics. And statistics is a way of mediating perspectives about bodies, like the idea that we don't have access to the actual data about the bodies that are being measured, but only to parameters and measurements that therefore abstract it. And so all of these contingent notions of disability sort of build up a scaffolding around ideas of disability, but it's not necessarily identified in an explicit way. So the sources from my research, and I'm not a historian, so this is kind of part of why I called the book Embodied Archive, because I did do archival work as well as sort of literary theory, literary studies in the book. But I spent about 5 months in Mexico City looking at public health and public education archives, as well as reading various novels and treatises by physicians of the period. And the idea of the embodied archive really has to do with the notion that this archival research is inevitably self-reflexive. So I'm interested in the moment of encounter as kind of a lived embodied experience, and looking at what happens when we take up these texts in the present moment and how they come to mean something new as we encounter them, right? Especially thinking about the fact that, you know, the term disability is not actually used in that period, or if it is, very rarely, right? And so this sort of exploration is seeking out and configuring a disability genealogy, perhaps against the grain, in the sense that that terminology was not yet available. So part of this sort of embodied archive and projection has to do with asking questions about what it means to live through these encounters, right, of encountering disability in those texts, and also how those documents come to mean something in our present moment, right? So how can we think about CRIP or disability futurity in relation to these notions of temporal contingency of disability, right? And the kind of temporal trajectory of disability that's so present in eugenic discourse of the period. How does that mean something new in our contemporary context, or in our present moment where we read discourses around like the Human Genome Project or the more specific Mexican Genome Project, and discourses around the risks of diabetes and hypertension for certain populations, right? How do those discourses become reconfigured through this archival encounter? So I wanted to speak briefly about some of the ways in which I think Tobin Siebers' work has been important and has had an impact on my thinking, and some of which I think comes out in the book. Some of it maybe sort of more subtle and general. I think in the first case, certainly this concept of complex embodiment, because as Siebers shows us, the social construction and the representation of disability adheres in bodies and ultimately becomes inseparable from the material experience and lived expressions of those bodies and of that disability knowledge. And so this has really helped me to understand things like, how we configure the relationship between this causes of disability that are sort of bracketed off in the past, or possibly going to be an effect or outcome in the future, right? That those discourses of cause and effect become sedimented into an experience and a configuration of disability as knowledge and as meaning and representation. Or also in the way that disability in school buildings and the bodies of school children sort of mutually configure one another, right? So that when furniture is described as rickety, and the children who are inhabiting or going to school in these facilities are described as likely to become sick, it's both the material construction and the metaphorical constructions of those human bodies and physical buildings that are upholding and configuring one another. And both of those sides becomes part of what or who they are. I think another sort of crucial insight for me, and it's more just a moment that that resonated for me in Tobin Siebers' work, was what I thought was a very good explanation that he gives of how the troping of disability underpins the troping of racial difference. And this was an explanation that really resonated for me, and how those tropings work together to form part of an aesthetics of human disqualification. And that explanation, simple and maybe clearly understood by all of us here now, but it has really helped me to sort out the ways in which disability and race in the Mexican context work together and are intertwined, especially when there's already so much important work from historians of science in the Mexican context on how race and racialization is constructed through, for example, the testing and monitoring of school children. And then finally, I would say that Siebers' really useful observations about trauma and wounding, right? And this is also in disability aesthetics, where he writes that the capacity to be wounded, injured, or traumatized is not always considered a feature of disability, but it should be. And generally in that chapter and elsewhere, his attention to trauma and vulnerability as part of a disability discourse and a way of thinking of disability, maybe as part of a discourse of nationalism and transnationalism, and this idea that discourses of trauma can help us to bridge, I think, this relationship between narratives of war and narratives of disability that are not necessarily confined, right, to spaces of war or the battlefield. And so that, I think, has also been really important to my understanding of, say, how we can understand narratives of the Mexican Revolution in relation to spaces of school children and testing, or in the more contemporary context, the so-called war on drugs in Mexico and its very catastrophic repercussions, how those spaces resonate and are part of a discourse of racialization and ideas of pathology and undesirable differences. So I hope that gives a little bit of an overview of the book. I would generally say that there's no way to give an overview, so I hope that people will read at least bits of it or check out some of the images. And thank you so much for listening and for putting the panel together.
Thank you so much, Susan. I can assure you that the 580 class next semester will read the book. Okay, so our disability studies graduate class, and we hope to have you there as well. So we owe you an email. And that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Thank you to everybody here. This was such a rich presentation, linking us deeply into Tobin Siebers' work and also deeply into each of your works. We even have a few minutes left, and I haven't seen any questions yet, but I would love to just invite you once more, audiences, to please, if you have a question, put it into the Q&A box or into the chat. I don't think this is the kind of environment where we can just make you visible, but we certainly have time for 1 or 2 questions here. Thank you so much to Sarah and Teresa from the press for hosting all this, for making this all possible, for bringing this wonderful bunch of people together. Right. Okay, someone here, lovely. Yeah, thank you. Lena Berg has a really interesting question. She knows that this wasn't specifically talked about, but I was wondering if there is anyone that has anything to say about sex education and disability. Thank you so much, Lena. Let's hand that over to our panel. Sex education and disability. Certainly a lot of interesting material there. We had a presentation that looked at sexual cultures and disability frameworks, which is very much based on some very exciting ethnographic anthropological work, particularly in the UK around sexuality. Corbett O'Toole's work is something that Tobin draws upon. So there's a lot of really interesting work out there. But does someone address this in any way in their classrooms right now, Cindy?
I want to make a plug for Mike Gill's book called Already Doing It, Sexual Agency and Intellectual Disability. It's a brilliant monograph that's so well researched and well written, and it touches on so many aspects about intellectual disability and sexual play, sexual agency, you know, in quotation marks. But the main takeaway I took from Gill's monograph is that historically, sex education for intellectually disabled people has focused on the mitigation of harm or the mitigation of risk, but being able to take risks and experience the consequences of risks is one of the ways that we can grant full human status to people with intellectual disabilities. So risk is a good thing.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Cindy. And Mike was here earlier. I saw him. He was here.
Yeah,
he was
I saw
visiting
him.
with us. This is lovely. And we have a question. I think we just have literally 1 minute left, but I just invite everybody, panelists and audiences, to write into the chat an answer to this question. What is the best way to stay up to date and or discover previous contributions to disability culture? Everybody, if you're happy to talk, say something. Otherwise, take this last minute to put some comments in here, because that seems such a great question. What are your core resources for disability culture?
And
Petra, there's also a question for Susan that I'm seeing from Maren Linnet that maybe Susan could quickly answer before we close down.
Okay, sorry, I can't see that one.
No, that's okay. It's in the chat.
Okay.
And Maren asked, she said she's excited to read both books, but Susan, which chapter do you think would teach best to undergrads in a class called Bodies and Cultures? The students will not be English majors. So just wanted to make sure we got to that as well. Sorry to interrupt you, Petra.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. Too many screens.
Yeah. No, I don't know. I mean, I think maybe check out the introduction, honestly, or maybe chapter 3 would be fun since it's about architecture. So less literary.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And there are some really interesting and rich answers here. I'm just reading them out. Crystal wrote about 2 resources. One is from Graphic Medicine, a special issue of biography. Yeah, and one is from also a Graphic Medicine book. I would add to this Zooglossia, for instance. I don't really think I'm very good at speaking and writing at the same time, but here we go. Zooglossia, which is a disabled poets organization. Since Invalid, which is a performance organization out of the Bay Area, very important disability justice work. Word Gathering. I'm just making sure that people who have joined us here have a little bit of other resources to go to. Word Gathering is another really interesting journal, particularly for those of us who do literary work. So just giving a few hints of where it can go. Okay. And there are just, okay, and there was an anonymous question about multiple chemical sensitivity. We're once again too many things on at the same time. But I think at this point, it is 4:31 and our panelists have been with us for an hour and a half. And I think this was a fabulous panel. I thank you so much for your rich and generous contributions. And I thank you, I thank the organizers, I thank you, the audience, for celebrating with us Tobin Siebers' contributions to disability studies, the publication of the book by these fabulous editors here, and of course, also Susan Antebi's book. Thank you so much for all of this. And I hope to see you all soon at the next Disability Studies and Disability Culture convening. Thank you.
Thank you